And does anybody know, without looking, no cheating, what's the 10th commandment? Don't covet your neighbor's goods, right? Don't covet your neighbor's goods. So it's interesting. In fact, from the Catechism, this is how it begins. You shall not covet, it's referencing the commandment, anything that is your neighbor's. You shall not desire your neighbor's house, his field, or his manservant, or maidservant, or his ox, or his ass, or anything that is your neighbor's. And then it says, quoting our Lord from the Sermon on the Mount, for where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. And isn't that interesting? Right? The 10th commandment unfolds and completes the 9th. And so the 9th commandment is do not covet your neighbor's wife or your spouse, the spouse. The 10th commandment unfolds and completes the 9th, which is concerned with concupiscence of the flesh. What's that fancy word concupiscence mean again? That's a great, when we watch Wheel of Fortune, I always hope that we get like concupiscence up there. That'd be a great word. There's a lot of money in that word. Concupiscence is right. It's that attraction that we have to sin, right? It's why we don't have to teach little Johnny to lie when he puts his hand in the cookie jar, right? It's this disordered seduction by sin, right? It's not sin itself. Concupiscence is not sin itself. That's why if you say to Father, I was tempted to sin. I was, whatever that sin might be, I was tempted. I didn't give in to the temptation. I fought the temptation. Father's going to tell you, well, that's not sin. That's great. Good. You fought. You had the battle, right? Because you didn't entertain the temptation. You didn't let it fester within you. You didn't have fun with it, if you will, right? You were fighting it. Well, that temptation, that external reality that comes upon you, that's called concupiscence. And your internal disposition is to go, oh, what is this? And then you fight it, right? Now, just by way of reminder, unfortunately, Martin Luther and John Calvin and Ulrich Zwingli, they all thought concupiscence was sin. And that's really one of the reasons why you have a Protestant Reformation, because they don't understand that concupiscence in and of itself is not a sin. But anyway, it is concerned with concupiscence of the flesh. It forbids coveting the goods of another as the root of theft, robbery, and fraud, which the 7th commandment forbids. Lust of the eyes leads to the violence and injustice forbidden by the 5th commandment. Avarice, like fornication, originates in the idolatry prohibited by the first 3 prescriptions of the law. And this is the money line, and now I'm going to read Romans 7. The 10th commandment concerns the intentions of the heart, along with the 9th. It summarizes all the precepts of the law. Isn't it interesting that the 9th and 10th commandment deals with coveting? What makes coveting utterly unique from the other 8 commandments? What makes it utterly unique in the prohibitions? Think about it. You can see murder, right? You can see robbery. You can see idolatry. But you can't really see coveting. You don't know it, right? It's an easily hidden sin. Let me read to you from Romans chapter 7. And Scott Hahn has a commentary out on Romans. I recommend getting that commentary. It is well worth it, where he actually spends time breaking down the writing of Paul. But Hahn and others have pointed out that it's interesting that in Romans chapter 7, St. Paul is dealing, if you will, with the believer's relationship to the law of God. Okay? And Paul begins to describe this struggle with the law. that the believer has, okay? And it gets very dense and complicated and nuanced, and it's not just about that, but it's about that at the very least, okay? So verse 5, chapter 7, for while we were living in the flesh, concupiscence of the flesh, for while we were living in the flesh, our sinful passions, aroused by the law, were at work in our members to bear fruit for death. Okay? So he's talking about this. Okay. The law, he's almost saying the law is kind of an instigator too. Like, wouldn't you like to keep the law? Can't do it, right? It's like, you're teasing me, right? It's kind of what Paul says some things about the law that I wish he never said, because I scratch my head and say, well, you've made my life harder now. Like the other day in 1 Corinthians 15, I read 1 Corinthians 15 in class on the resurrection. Just a little shout out to my daughter. So Monday morning, I was getting ready to go to work, and she stops me as I was saying goodbye. Bye, honey. I'll see you later. Pick you up later. She says, Dad, I know what you're going to talk to your students about today. And I said, what, honey? What am I going to talk to my students about? She goes, you're going to talk to them about the resurrection, aren't you? Yes, I am. Yes, I am. And I had been thinking about it or whatever. And I'm like, well, maybe I'll talk about the mass. I don't know. So, you know what? I'll talk about the resurrection. But in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul makes this statement. He says, in the law is the power of sin. And it's one of those things where I say, I hope nobody heard that. It's one of those times where I wish nobody in the class was listening. Like, I hope nobody heard me say, in the law is the power of sin. Because that requires like 10 classes on what Paul's trying to say. So in Romans 7, he'll say some things where you go, is he blaming the law? Is he blaming the law for why we sin? And then, of course, Paul anticipates that some people hearing him are going to say, you're blaming the law. And then Paul says, make anoint so. God forbid. No, I'm not blaming the law. Gee, Paul, maybe you want to clarify some things. And he does. That's why he does clarify some things. Verse 7, what then shall we say? Is the law sin? By no means. Make anoint so. God forbid. Yet if it had not been for the law, I would not have known sin. So the law there for Paul functions kind of like a mirror, right? I look in the mirror and I go, oop, I gotta shave. I've got to brush my teeth. If I had some hair, I got to do my hair, right? Got to do my hair. I'm like Charlie Brown. I got one little strand right there. So now here's it. I would not have known sin. Listen to this. For I would not have known what it is to covet if the law had not said, you shall not covet. See that? Unless the law said don't covet, it's not something that you just naturally know. Because what's one of the things, and I get this, from the temporal order, the government cannot execute judgment on internal dispositions, can it? It tried, right, wait. Somebody just said wait, right? And that's always dangerous, right? The law, the human law can only deal with what is done. It can't deal with what you were thinking inside of yourself, what's hidden away, what nobody knows, right? So if somebody murders somebody, say, oh, there it is, we can see that. But with coveting, it's purely internal. But this is why St. Augustine actually says that envy and coveting, in a certain sense, is the most grotesque of all sins. Precisely because it is so hidden. Right? What's the great enemy? Oftentimes, it's the enemy that can't be seen. The enemy you can fight that enemy, but I can't fight the hidden enemy. And so Paul says, for I would not have known what it is to covet if the law had not said, you shall not covet. Verse 8, now this is, but sin, seizing an opportunity through the commandment. That's that language again where Paul goes, wait, so sin, yeah, he's saying that sin latches on to the commandment, if you will. You ever notice sometimes how you try not to think about something? Don't think about the pink elephant in the room, and then what happens, right? Produced in me, sin, seizing an opportunity through the commandment, produced in me all kinds of covetousness. For apart from the law, sin lies dead. Oh, Paul, why'd you say that? That's why you got to get Scott Hahn's commentary on Romans, okay? It's well worth it, all right? He doesn't mean that the law is sinful. What he's ultimately going to get at is that the law would love to bring us to heaven, but the law can't. The law was never made for that. The law can't, not because the law is a problem. In fact, a little bit later, he's going to say the law is just and holy and good, and it reveals God's mind on things. But the law can't do it because the stuff that the law has to work with is broken. You and me, we're broken. We are born under sin. So when we see the commandment, do not covet, right? The law would love to be able to provide for us the ability not to covet, but it wasn't given for that intention. Think about it this way. Call up a company and say, let's say a soda company, and say, listen, I got a real issue with you and I want my money back. And if not, I'm going to sue you. I used your product to clean my carpets. And now they have caramel color stain in there. I watched, you can believe this stuff today, right? Where somebody goes on YouTube and says, use this product, people dropping tomato sauce on the carpet and taping this. Okay. Now my carpet is stained. Really? You're shocked, right? But you call the company and say, well, hey, I want my money back. Company's going to say, no, I'm not giving you your money back because that's not the proper use of the product. Well, if you will, St. Paul is saying with the law, if the law is being used by you to save you, then you're not using the law the right way. The law cannot save you. All it can do really in the end is reveal to you what sin is and the fact that you don't measure up. Yes, Richard. What do you love, man? That's where the money is. You got to go where the money is. Right. So he goes on to have this incredible discussion about the law and its relationship to the believer. And then he says a little bit later, especially as he gets into Romans 8, what the law was powerless to do, God did by his Spirit. Because the law is external to us, right? But guess what the Spirit does? The Spirit is internal to us. The Spirit comes to live within us. And read Romans 7 and Romans 8. It's powerful. I love the language there. Again, Scott Hahn's commentary on a letter to the Romans. My wife noticed it in a certain cart that I have. And so I'm glad that she's here. It's really, really a good commentary. It's really good. And this is my profession. So just like somebody needs tools if they're a tool person, or Steve, who works really well with wood and can fix saints. How many books can you read at one time, honey? Watch. So anyway, all right. So he goes on to talk about this, about how the law is holy, the commandment is holy, it is good, right? But then he goes on to talk about this internal struggle, right? For I know that nothing good, verse 18, for I know that nothing good dwells in me, that is in my flesh. Think about the first line of the 10th commandment here in the Catechism. Concupiscence of the flesh. For I know that nothing good dwells in me, that is in my flesh. Here it is. For I have the desire to do what is right, but I do not have the ability to carry it out. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I keep on doing. Now, if I do what I do not want, it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. So I find it to be a law that when I want to do right, evil lies close at hand. That's language from Genesis chapter 4, right? Cain and Abel, and Genesis tells us that sin is crouching at the door, waiting for Cain, waiting for you. And so, somebody comes in through that door and there's somebody right there by the light switch and they come right out, right? Well, that's sin, right? And it traps you, okay? So he goes on. I would really encourage you, especially if you're struggling in the faith, like if you're struggling trying to do what is right. How many times do people say, and Dave, who comes on Wednesday nights, loves to tell this story. When Scott Hahn first became Catholic, he went to confession on a frequent basis. And he would get frustrated with himself because he found himself confessing the same sins over and over again. And so the priest, who Monsignor Bruskowitz, Fabian Bruskowitz, eventually became Bishop Fabian Bruskowitz, Monsignor Bruskowitz told Scott Hahn, he says, "What do you want? New ones? Right? What do you want? New ones? What do you want? Other sins? Be happy that these are the on some level, right? But there is sometimes that feeling that confession is somehow lacking. My receptivity to sacrament is somehow lacking because I am confessing the same sins over and over again. And what's the point? Read Romans 7. Because the great apostle Paul, who wrote half the New Testament, seems to be in the same boat as you and me. The good I want to do, I do not do. How many times have you wanted to do the good? I'm going to pray. I'm going to pray today for 30 minutes. And the day happens, and you find out that Nick Saban got a top-level class, and no need, right. And then you get distracted, whatever it is. You wind up watching cat videos on YouTube for 3 hours straight. Right? You were going to pray, right? That battle, there's a battle. Isn't there a battle inside of you? Right? And so I love how he ends this section, verse 24. Well, just for a little background, verse 22, for I delight in the law of God in my inner being, but I see in my members another law waging war against the law of my mind and making me captive to the law of sin that dwells in my members. Wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ, our Lord, right? So Paul is not overly introspective. Listen, in the spiritual life, the church does not want you being overly introspective. It really doesn't. In fact, you can make the argument that on some level, that's what caused Luther's problems, right? Martin Luther's problems was, according to his own biography and his own words about it, and others who have written about him, like Roland Baton, Luther claims to go to confession 3-4 times a day. Overly scrupulous, right? If you're so introspective, you become intensely scrupulous, you become paralyzed. And then you will come to the point in your life where Luther actually said, in reference to God, love God, I hate him. Those are not my words. Those were his words. He said that. And I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that he was so overly introspective, he didn't get any joy in his faith. Okay? Because if you and I were to spend a lot of time thinking about ourselves and our own inclinations, you probably would be pretty miserable. Because look at all the times we fail in life, quote unquote, right? As parents, you struggle with, could I have done this better? Could I have done that better, right? It's all of these different things that you beat yourself up with. And that's one of the great liberations, I think, of Mass, the fact that we get that stuff out of the way right away, don't we? Because we start pretty much early on by saying, yeah, I'm messed up. Right? Through my fault, through my most grievous fault. Right? Just in case you didn't get it the first time, the second time, we're going to get it the third time, right? We screw up. And then we hear the priest get up there and say, you people are a bunch of wretches. You're disgusting. I want nothing to do with you. I'm leaving. I'm going to say Mass by myself. It's not what he says, right? He gives us the assurance of forgiveness, of pardon. And that's a real confession. Venial sins are taken away in that moment. There's multiple times throughout the Mass where the venial sins are taken away. And so we hear the word of God, that promise of God working in us. I would really encourage Romans 7, but it's interesting. Paul in his treatment there of the law doesn't talk about idolatry, doesn't talk about blasphemy. He doesn't talk about murder. He doesn't talk about adultery. He talks about coveting. Internal, interior, right? And now, do you get why St. Augustine says this in a certain sense is the sin of all sins? Because really, where does every sin begin? Within. It begins within. It begins hidden, right? It begins hidden. So, all right. The disorder of covetous desires. The sensitive appetite leads us to desire pleasant things we do not have. The desire to eat when we are hungry or to warm ourselves when we are cold. These desires are good in themselves, but often they exceed the limits of reason and drive us to covet unjustly what is not ours and belongs to another or is owed to him. Remember when Father Schubert talked about the faculties of the soul? Right? Theologians debate the faculties and how they are, but for the sake of the discussion, let's just kind of focus on passions, intellect, and will, but we can define the passions and intellect. Sometimes you'll have Father Schubert talk about imagination. That falls under, if you will, the category of the intellect, right? To imagine things, right? To image itself. So we won't get into the finer points of that, right? Because St. Thomas Aquinas talks about the sensitive appetites and, you know, the various types of appetites that we have. It gets, I quite frankly feel like it gets a little bogged down in minutia when we get like that. So for the sake of the discussion, and anybody who's watching this that I send this to, who's a high-level theologian, I fully know that we can define these terms a little bit differently. But for the sake of the discussion, passions, intellect, and will, right? So the passions, are the passions good or bad? Thank God that babies can cry when they're hungry. Because if not, we might not know that they're hungry, right? So the baby cries, right? The baby cries when the baby feels pain, right? Or the baby is uncomfortable, the baby cries. Baby needs a diaper change. Baby cries, right? Those are the passions, right? Nobody wants to feel uncomfortable. The baby doesn't know why the baby is uncomfortable. The baby just knows, I don't like this feeling. It's also the way that the baby begins to love the mother, really, because whenever the baby has this feeling, this person with this voice always seems to come and save the day, okay? And you can see how that works, right? The passions, neither good nor bad, good in a certain sense, right? But if we grow up and in the intellect, as we reach that age of, right? We've all heard that, right? Age of reason. There's no magical number. There's no magical formula. In theory, you could send your 5-year-old child to Father and say, Father, I think my son is at a little bit higher level of aptitude. I think they know a little bit more. Could you at least interview him for First Confession and Eucharist? And canon law says that the priest can do that. Now, for pastoral reasons, he may say, well, you know, maybe we're putting a little bit too much pressure, right? Because there's no hard and fast rule, no magic number. But we've kind of eyeballed it over the years, just like I made the decaf this morning. I say I eyeball it when I put the coffee in. Err on a little bit of the stronger side, right? Nobody likes weak coffee. And you can't save weak coffee, by the way. You can't. It's once it's weak, it's weak. But strong, you can weaken. So there you go. So here you go. So you have, right? I'm right. I'm right. My wife just laughed at me. There we go. Thank you. So now I lost my train of thought. Weak coffee. Where were we before that? I have no idea. But it was good. It was really, really, really good. Oh, okay. The appetites. Right. There we go. Right. So the intellect, right? And the key thing here, age of reason, we eyeball it out. We go, you know what? About the age of 7, right? About the age of 7, we can kind of sense that our child begins to know a little bit more about what's right and what's wrong and why it is, why it is, right? And then there's that development. The key thing that always trips people up when we talk about the intellect as a faculty of the soul is we immediately think book smarts, don't we? We think SAT score, ACT score. That's not what we mean by intellect. Though there's a relationship. I'm not going to say there's not a relationship, but let me tell you something. The fact is, you think in terms of St. John Vianney. St. John Vianney was not going to be doing 3 PhDs. Now, John Paul II is a saint, but I think it's fair to say that John Vianney would not even be able to hold a candlestick to the book smarts of John Paul II or Pope Benedict XVI. Yet, I think if you would ask either Benedict XVI or John Paul II, who had a higher level of sanctity, I think they would probably both say John Vianney. John Vianney. Now, we're not going to get into the game of playing like who's better. That's not the point. But the point is, let's not mistake intellect as book smarts, taking a test. No, the intellect is moral formation. I said this, I remember some years ago, to our former president, Ann Caesar. We had a great conversation. And recently, apparently Chinese scientists and American scientists are working again on taking human embryos and mixing them together. What can go wrong with that? Well, about 8-9 years ago, the British Institute of Health, if you may remember that, doing the same stuff. And I remember saying to Ann, and she was horrified by this, and we were talking about it. I said, Ann, we always have to remember that the kids that were the national merit finalists and the 35s and 36s on the ACT, they're the ones that they're the ones behind this. It's not Johnny sitting in a corner, who's not caring a single thing about his schoolwork, because it takes a really high level of mental acumen to be able to do this stuff. Okay? And that's the tragedy. I had one of my former students who graduated, I cannot believe, 8 years ago. He's currently at Stanford. I won't mention the university he went to, but it's in Massachusetts, and it's a technology school. And he visited us, and we still keep in touch. He visited us after his second year there. I mean, he would come back and visit a little bit. But after his second semester there in 2015, he hung out with myself and my friend Joe, who teaches religion, also a Catholic. And he said, the thing I'm most bothered by where I'm at school is my classmates, almost to a person, all believe that because we could do something, we should do it. And I am that lone voice that says, no, that cannot be the rubric. Yes, it's exciting. He says, trust me, it's exciting. But just because we could do it doesn't mean we should do it. We have to take a step back and say, what's the implications? And so he was saying how, I talking to these guys about St. Thomas Aquinas and the principle of double effect. These students had no idea. Lamp is an amazing school, but they're not talking about Aquinas' principle of double effect there. They're not talking about the hierarchy of truths. And so as far as piety goes, that's great. You can live your faith, pray your rosary. That's awesome. But once you get into the particulars of some of these high-level things, you really have to know how the church's mind is on something. It's very, very important because it's very dangerous. But that intellectual formation, the moral formation, those things are very, very important. And so if the passions have not been sifted through a morally driven intellectual formation, what's going to happen? Right. Exactly. Might makes right. Power. Father Driscoll loves to talk about this. I just mentioned this on the radio the other day. Father Driscoll has two phrases that I have stolen and made my own. One is, we are awash in the acid bath of secularism. I love when he says that because it's true. It's just the air that we breathe. It's just the air that we breathe, right? Secularism is just kind of flooding our lives. We don't even necessarily know it, but it's an acid bath. It ain't good. And then the other one is Nietzsche's will to power. For Friedrich Nietzsche, the way forward in life was power. That's what Nietzsche said you needed, power, the will to power. And so when concepts like justice are no longer tethered to the ultimate justice, God, you think that's a good place to be for fallen humanity? No, right? It's never a good place to be. And so that will to power, right? And so we just count heads, and if we have the power, we win. And that's dangerous. But that's what happens when the passions, yes, Chuck. Right. It's all power. Yeah. And that's why when people have power and don't use it, they don't help their cause, right? I mean, because there's a real power, right? And there's good power and bad power. And so that's one of the things that this is saying here, right? The sensitive appetite or the passions, they lead us to desire pleasant things. Say, look, I don't want to be cold if I don't have to, right? But if we're not formed properly, these desires can often exceed the limits of reason and drive us to covet unjustly what is not ours. Right. Let me have more. Let me have 19 donuts. Nobody that I know ever did that. But it was a donut eating contest.
I always believe that God is more than willing to reveal the secrets of the universe to man, but he does not do it. He restrains himself because we would abuse it.
Right.
Like we abuse atomic energy. What was meant for good, we use it for evil.
Right.
Like all that we know about reproductive history, what have we done with that? Reproductive processes, what have we done with that?
Right.
We're using it for evil.
Right.
Now, I believe there's a cure for cancer that God is just dying to give us, but he doesn't want us to abuse it, and therefore he can hold, and that's which plays into the
right.
definition of covetousness, with used and without wisdom, the knowledge used without wisdom leads us into confusion.
Right. And it's fascinating because we're doing Genesis, and I remember when we talked about early on in Genesis with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life, and God kept us from the tree of life precisely for that reason, right? Right. Because now, with us in a fallen state and the way we are, man has an amazing capacity to be inhuman to his fellow man, right? I remember some years ago, in early 91, the University of Minnesota did a roundtable ethical discussion on the scientific experimentation after the Holocaust. And in this discussion, in this roundtable discussion with people from all over the world talking about it, the line was, we got rid of it all. We threw it out. The academic consensus is there's no way they didn't throw it out. We kept it. Now, everybody denies that. But as this article went on to talk about, or at the conference, did you hear about, this conference I'm talking about? University of Minnesota in 1991 had a roundtable, blah, 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 scholarly articles and whatever. But that you look at the growth in the technological advancements since World War II in terms of medical research, and what do we do with that, right? Because man and woman have an inclination to take information or to manipulate information and use it as a weapon. And it's fascinating that this primordial book, Genesis, what could it have to say today, spoke such deep and penetrating truths thousands and thousands of years ago, right? You know what I'm talking about when they say that they got rid of it, and then there's like we didn't get rid of it. Right.
There are some pretty, almost everybody that does research on humans and animals has to operate under these constraints. I'm not sure what they're saying about not being there, or they got rid of it, because they are in place. I think though, if you like maybe the bars is really, I think that's the thing. Again, if you take a utilitarian kind of thing, and the standard is that you don't harm somebody, but doing the research, but it actually becomes a calculus between the potential good outcome.
Right. Steve is talking about, how the rubric is, well, we're not going to harm somebody, but the way you kind of get around that is like, well, we make a calculus decision. And that's what he mentioned before, consequential, whether they're consequential. And that's why consequentialism and utilitarianism are basically the philosophical systems that have probably won the day, or at least the language that people use to kind of get us sentimentally. Well, if we don't use the embryos, embryos are just going to be thrown away anyway. So let's use the embryos, and we can cure Parkinson's disease. And it's, if you're not formed in any kind of moral formation, it's like, well, that seems reasonable, right? But it's always this seduction. It's always this seduction, right? Oh yeah, exactly. Right. It's always worse. It's like,
we'll come back and debate, the ethics of this. And I'm still thinking it's already done.
right.
Right. Already did it. I'm sure they had approval.
It's funny you said that, because on a related issue, moral issue, a friend of mine years ago said, once you've already even begun the process of the public debate, you've already lost. It's just only a matter of time. It's like if we had could you imagine a public debate on the merits of stealing from a business? Pro or con? Well, you've already lost that. Yes, Tom.
So about 10 minutes ago, you mentioned St. Augustine's double effect. I have no clue what you were talking about.
Oh, the principle of double effect. Saint Thomas talks about it. Others. The principle of double effect is basically this: you allow or tolerate an equal to or greater good if there's a conflict. For example, the one that people will often use. Let me use this one. Dr. Janet Smith and Father Gregory Pine just had a wonderful discussion on the Matt Fradd podcast on, is lying ever okay? Basically, the conundrum is the Nazis show up at your door and say, all right, Tom, where are the Jewish people that you're hiding? You have any Jewish people in here? And what do? Well, if you lie, well, there you go. You violated the commandment. You got yourself caught up there. The 8th commandment, you lied, bore false witness. Okay. But if you give them the truth that, yes, I have Jewish people here, then you run into the situation of they're dead. They're gonna die. They're gonna be killed unjustly. So what do? You're damned if you do, damned if you don't, right? That's the whole idea. Well, the church's teaching says not so fast. And there's some quibbles on how we define that. But fundamentally, there's two concepts in play here. One is called the hierarchy of truth. I would really encourage you, by the way, maybe I should send the link out. It's 2 hour and 20-minute give and take. These two do a great job. They both basically agree. They both basically say, no, you don't tell the Nazis that you have the Jewish people in your thing. The way they define some of that is a little different. But fundamentally, the hierarchy of truth. So the 10 commandments. Is there a hierarchy of the commandments? And the answer on some level is yes, right? The first commandment in terms of idolatry and blasphemy and all of the obligations toward God have a primacy, right? That doesn't mean the other ones are not important. It just means that there's a primacy. So take the first commandment. You shall have no other gods before me. You need to give God first place in your life. All right. Honor your mother and father. What do? That's the fourth commandment. Well, let's say you're 9 and you can't go to mass on your own. Well, then you can't fulfill the obligation. But you're not held liable for that because you're under that age and all that. Well, what if you're now 16 or 17 and you have a driver's license and you have a car, but your parents say, I don't want you to go to mass. You're not going to mass. And they don't want you to go to mass because they don't want you to, they're atheists. Hierarchy of truths. Yes, ordinarily honor your mother and father. But in this case, hierarchy of truths, I got to go to mass, right? You're not violating the fourth commandment. You're honoring the first commandment. And so, but people will try to play against that. Say, well, you can't lie. So the Nazis, you can't lie to me, so tell me the truth. You good Catholic, you good, Martin Niemöller or Dietrich Bonhoeffer, you're supposed to be a good Christian. You can't lie to me, so tell me where they are. Well, the Christians, like Corrie ten Boom and whatnot, they knew how to kind of finagle that. They knew they had to finagle that. But were they sinning by not telling the truth? And the answer is no. The church's teaching would say, no, they're not sinning by not telling the truth, because in that case, and John Paul has written this as, by the way, you can also add that when it comes to telling the truth in that case, does the person have the right to the truth? That's an implication. Does that Nazi have the right to the truth? And reasonable people here would all say what? Do they have the right to that truth? No, because what they're going to do with that truth is they're going to murder. So the principle of hierarchy of truths and double effect. So the principle of double effect would be, okay, I may have to violate the eighth commandment here, but I'm violating the eighth commandment because I want to affirm the fifth commandment. I tolerate the fact that I'm in a compromised situation for an equal to or greater outcome. Does that make sense?
Yes.
That's basic. Would you say that that's the basic principle of the double effect?
So, actually, there's a range of effects, and some of them are not acceptable. You're not choosing it from a
Right. You're not right. You're not choosing to lie for the sake of lying. You're choosing to lie because you want to affirm life.
So, church, in the hierarchy, with the cardinals and the bishops, the primacy is, life and abortion,
Right.
And yet they're taking now all these other issues and making them as a whole prime issue.
Right.
So we have our own church leadership leading us down the wrong path. Because they're not
Right.
because they don't have the guts to stand up for the primacy of life.
Right. And that's why Archbishop Brody's article on the issue of abortion in October, he actually said, look, we can get into political debates all we want, but at the end of the day, the fundamental issue is the right to life and the issue of abortion. You guys remember that article that he wrote in October? And he said, this has to be the primacy. And what's heartbreaking to me, and I love that Archbishop Brody wrote that, and I don't think, and I say this on the radio, so if the Archbishop were accidentally to hear me say this, unfortunately, our diocese is only 65,000 Catholics, and our largest paper is in Birmingham, and it just doesn't register. But if Cardinal Dolan said that, the New York Times would have to pick it up. And he might get called on TV to have to be interviewed on the Today Show. And this is where I wish that some of the bishops in those prominencies, I believe we have a prominency because of the fact that we're blessed, but our prominence doesn't come from our being in the shadow of the media empire like New York or size like LA, right? And those guys are always strangely silent on these issues, and I don't know why. And, but that's why the Archbishop Brody said, this has to be the primary issue, right? Because if you don't have the right to life, then what do you care about a living wage? What do you care about economic situations, right? You didn't even live, right? And that's the crazy thing about the whole process.
So would we be allowed to, if we get permission to that article in August, would we be allowed to send that to other bishops that aren't speaking out?
Yeah, why not? I mean, as a member of the faithful,
I'm just trying to find
you have the right,
doing something.
and it would be from October, but you would have the right to send to another bishop and say, with respect, Your Eminence, here's an article written by an archbishop in his own right, where he's very clear on this issue. This is primacy. This is the fundamental issue. This has to be the definitive issue that we use as our criteria. Everything else will flow from that. I strongly encourage you to prayerfully consider the words of your fellow bishop, and please don't hide behind the bishops' conference and that's one of the things I appreciate about our diocese is we're not very much a bishops' conference diocese. That doesn't mean that we're not involved with the bishops' conference. It just means that Archbishop Brody takes very seriously the fact that he's in Mobile. He doesn't fly around to Rome. He doesn't go to conferences in Chicago. He doesn't give plenary talks at Villanova and to be very frank, a lot of times what a red hat means in the church, I hate to say it, what a cardinal hat means in the church is you're now a Catholic clerical celebrity. And on some level you are. And I think that's disgusting. Because they wear the red because the red symbolizes they're going to die as a martyr. And in many cases they're not. And there are some good ones, and I don't want to say that none, but I do think that's an issue that we have to be aware of. So
One of the things that we talked earlier about teaching, and if you look at the termination of what we want to do, they're quoting Paul, who was a devotee of teaching.
Right.
This is where they're getting in a lot of you look at where you start at, it's very logical, but you start from an error, you're going to go, you're going to make errors all along the way.
St. Thomas Aquinas. That's right.
Logical errors.
A small error at the beginning leads to a cataclysmic error at the end. And that's exactly what you were saying before. It always starts innocently. It always starts, well, we're just trying to help. And the next thing you know, you're like, whoa, what happened? Where'd this happen? You know.
The whole idea of the seamless garment.
Right. Right.
That's where a lot of this
Right.
comes from. It's garbage.
Right.
It's garbage.
I don't think there's any system, letter. I mean, it's like somebody told me, years ago, they said, if somebody smokes cigarettes now, it's not because they're ignorant of what's going to happen. They're fully cognizant of what that's going to do to them. And these guys are choosing to take that aside. They know they're not dying, but we have to see there's I've been trying to think of this internally, I'm not gonna fall on my sword for everything, So I mean, if I go to mass and most people are wearing masks, I'm gonna wear a mask, even though I've got my 2 vaccinations. I'm not gonna fall on that sword. I'm not gonna get out. I want to confront people and say, like when I see a person driving in a car and they're alone and they're wearing a mask, I mean, I've done it and now I've forgotten, because I had it on and I just take it off. But they're stupid. I mean, and there's people that are stupid and there are people that are morons. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is I need to decide what I'm going to fall on, what sword I'm going to fall on. And I think as a Catholic that I am disgusted with our church leadership. And I look at Bishop Brody as one of the good leaders. And, and there are people, Cardinal Dolan, I mean, bless, we need to pray for him. But, he's yeah, I brought those dozen donuts for me. You talk about it. Oh, yeah. He talks about freaking food, and he's obese,
And he's referencing the show, which honestly, if you ever listen to the Cardinals show, it's just a yuck fest. I hate to say it, and that pains me. That pains me to say, but it's basically just a yuck fest on Sirius Radio that has the opportunity. You know what? Yuck it up, have fun. But when the content of the show is always the same dopey jokes about cigars and food and scotch,
Right.
It's like, come on.
So anyway, so internally, I'm trying to figure out what I can do to influence not only our church leadership, or tell them that they're wrong, and our politicians. Because it goes back to this, well, we pass the bill and then we'll read what's in it. No. You get on the House of the floor and you read every single word, and you get people, I have people beaten with sticks. But anyway,
Here's what I would say. I would agree. You have the right to send it, but I do agree, like what Steve says, like a lot of these guys know it. But I do think there's a cathartic aspect of saying, you know what? I can hold my head up high and say, hey, listen, Your Excellency, here's what one of your fellow bishops sent. Prayerfully consider doing something like this. And I do think that can have, you never know. All it has to do is work in a case of one. But I do think Steve's right to say for most of these guys, they probably won't even be the ones reading it. There'll be some secretary and, right. Right. All right. Next week, we'll talk about envy. We'll talk about St. Augustine. Envy is the diabolical sin. And why it's a capital sin. And we'll refresh on the 7 deadly sins. Y'all know the 7 deadly sins? If you don't know them, all you have to do is come up with an acronym. PEG, P-E-G, PEG, lags. PEG, lags behind. So PEG, lags. Hey, PEG, stop lagging behind. PEG, lags. pride, envy, greed, lust, anger, gluttony, and sloth. Peg legs. There you go. There you go. That's your 7 deadly sins. So, all right, we'll close in prayer. Let us invoke the Holy Trinity in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and never shall be, world without end. Amen.